Welcome to today's webinar. We're really thankful to have you all here. As people join, I'll give them just another few seconds to log in and make sure their audio and video is working. But we're really excited to share. Both Barry and I are excited to share a lot of content around a really critical item that's part of the overall discussion around economic development and site selection, and that's immigration, mass deportations, and the cause and effects of both. So a topic that is very timely, and that all of us collectively are working together with our corporate clients, with our economic development partners, our stakeholders, and so on trying to figure out solutions as this evolves. But it looks like we've got people still logging in, but we'll go ahead and get started. Again, thank you so much for the opportunity to present to you today. This session will be shared a little bit later on, so in case you miss anything or want to listen to the recording, you'll have that opportunity at a later date. A couple just quick housekeeping items. For your convenience, everyone's muted just to make sure there isn't background noises, but there will be an opportunity at the end of the webinar to ask any questions before we adjourn. This session is recorded, again, for the opportunity to share it with everybody later on, and that will be given here in the next couple of days once the team packages up and gets it ready and sends it out. So stay tuned for that. And of course, beyond today, if you have any questions or feedback, looking forward to that. You can reach out to anybody in any of our teams accordingly. So excited to partner today with Barry. Barry, how are you doing?
Doing good. How about you, Jason?
Great. We have the opportunity to collaborate quite a bit, and today is no exception. So quick backgrounds on both of us. I'll go ahead and start. Jason Hickey, CEO of Hickey and Associates. My job is to help facilitate the journey that corporate clients go through and other like businesses through site selection, location strategy, and all the different components that go into that. So workforce has been a challenge for us even before the pandemic, but only accelerated because of the pandemic effects. And now with immigration, that becomes a big part too. We're going to talk about today. But Barry, maybe speak a little bit about your deep background.
Sure. I think once again, we're on the other side of the table most of my life doing economic development for about 28 years at a bunch of different levels and having to sit on the other side of the table from site selectors and corporate clients and really have to tell that workforce story and always a critical piece of making sure that the company can come and grow in the area. I've been very excited to be kind of on the consulting side now and spending time with that, and also working with a lot of our clients on workforce issues, which is baked into almost every strategy. So glad to be here today and glad to be participating.
Thanks, Barry. And just a little bit of background about our collective firm. So, as I mentioned, I run the site selection piece of our sister companies. Barry is the CEO of the Economic Development Consulting component, and two additional things that we're really proud of. First, the Hickey Institute, which is the sponsor of today's event. It's really our thought leadership arm of the whole enterprise that um, we take components of our all of our teams as in addition some thought leaders that are out in our industry and beyond to put together some of the things we'll talk about today and we've talked about previously and in the future trends, but also just really interesting dynamics about research, but diving in layers that we don't see anywhere else. So excited to get into. As a reminder, there's a report that's available. I'll share the link here in a second, but something we're really proud of as well is the foundation. It's named after my father, who started Hickey and Associates almost 40 years ago. And it's something that's as he began his career as an economic development professional, we sponsor scholarships for economic developers that would otherwise not be able to get the proper training, certifications, or otherwise. So it's something they're really proud of, and I'm doing it for quite a few years. And so that's our makeup. We've got extensive experience around the world, but we really enjoy talking about very specific issues like today around immigration. We talked about power issues previously and what was happening after the election. We've got a few other really neat topics on the horizon on docket. But for any of you that hasn't seen the actual report, it's available free at any of our websites, either Hickey and Associates or Hickey Global. Go ahead and point your web browser to either of those sites, and you'll be able to download it accordingly. Want to start today's session with a little bit of a poll. So we like to do this just to get a sense of um, where where people's thought process might be. Those of you that are on your computers, you maybe even mobile phones for many of you, you'll see a poll that pops up, and very interested in getting your feedback because immigration policy has a lot of politics associated, has a lot of historical references for hundreds of years in the United States and beyond. And it's something that a lot of communities have relied on to be able to fill skill gaps across the US. All the above we're going to talk about today. We're just curious how you see immigration today, either slightly damaging positively or status quo. So we'll give everybody a moment to log in. I think we've got almost everybody on there. Give everyone a few more seconds, but I think predominantly when asking about the impacts of some of the immigration policy changes, damaging is at 69%, now 70%. The rest being slight, about 18%, and status quo and positive 6% itself. So um, really, really interesting. Really interesting how the large majority of you, more than almost three-fourths, look at it as damaging. We're going to talk about a few of the elements that new immigration policy changes will have an impact both on site selection and economic development in a moment. But definitely things that we all work together in both of those fields to try to figure out how to create solutions for our businesses, stakeholders, educational institutions, and also our citizens on how to address it as best as possible. So thank you for that. It's always fascinating to get your feedback as we go through this process because it helps us really make sure that some of the things that we're going to talk about today kind of aligns to your thought process as well. So today, U.S. immigration policy is changing pretty rapidly, and rapidly sometimes by the hour, certainly by the day, and just over the last few weeks, but also over the last few decades. There has been major changes that we have seen, but this stretch of 5, 6, 7 years is fairly unprecedented, at least in recent memory, in and around migration. So we've got everything from modified birthright citizenship and policies that are surrounding that, suspension of refugee administration program or mission programs. There's an app that the CBP has been using for a handful of years for immigrants that are looking to seek asylum or otherwise come to the country. The scheduling app to be able to apply for that process has been taken off the app. And of course, raids and deportation flights have commenced. And a lot of attention is probably towards the latter, the right-hand side of what you see on the screen nationally. But the impacts are significant, and we're going to talk about that today. So these actions on immigration policies, how are they impactful to businesses first? And we're going to talk about economic development in a few minutes, but workforce stability number one. So reduce access to any kind of skills or either skill or unskilled labor pools can have a dramatic effect when you have such a tight labor market already. So you've got areas of the country, we're going to look at some maps in a moment. You've got areas of the country that have very low unemployment and no migration. And I'm not speaking about immigration from outside the US, but inward migration within the US that naturally occurs for various reasons. You've got a lot of parts of the country that don't have either. And so where the skills have been, those gaps have been filled, or at least tried to be filled, is through immigration policies over the last decade or so. So the thought process of businesses is how do we fill those gaps moving forward? And if there was a major disruption of talent, either skilled or unskilled, how do we actually approach that? How do we train people to get them upskilled? How do we find new people and so on? Compliance as well is something that a lot of businesses are approaching us on, not just trying to fill gaps, but how do they remain compliant? So there's not an accidentally inadvertent non-compliant situation um, because the regulations are changing quickly. Most of the businesses, all the businesses we serve want to be in compliant. They want to follow the rules, regulations. But when things change so rapidly, they struggle sometimes in keeping track. So that's also something that's really keeping them up at night. And then obviously the disruption and the potential disruption is what a lot of companies have approached us on and looking for workforce challenges and where the gaps are in some of their footprint and their portfolio is where are we at highest risk? And of course, there's cause and effects of that. If you're an area that was maybe highlighted for an additional line or investment that has some of these challenges, it may not come to fruition anymore, at least short term until all this some of the skills and workforce gets sorted out. Reputational risk, of course, some of the public perception challenges, negative media attention, those things a lot of companies are trying to track and understand. And then the economic implications about just the labor costs rising, the churning of labor, getting back to what we saw in a negative way back into kind of the latter of the pandemic affected years, and so on are just something that companies are really concerned about. And so when we think about immigration policy um, today and the impacts, we break it up into a couple of different categories around industry sector. So um, a lot of attention is given to undocumented workers, for instance, on jobs like hospitality, agriculture, construction, and those are very prevalent. We're going to talk about how prevalent actually on the next slide. But software development, IT, professional services, and even manufacturing. Manufacturing represents a pretty significant percent of the workforce, even with undocumented workers that participate in manufacturing positions. If even a fraction of those were to somehow get disrupted, businesses have to plan. So the demand of all jobs is heavy, and for all intents and purposes, as heavy as it's been in a long time. Every job is critical. Every job has an impact to a business if for some reason that person can no longer fill that position. So the impacts overall are obviously the potential disruptions in depending on how large and significant in manufacturing capabilities and supply chain and other kind of talent shortages, things that we saw obviously in dramatic ways in the pandemic. But the challenges, there's not a lot of with gaps already there and with people potentially leaving positions and changing or not having the ability to add positions in the future because people are still were intended to come in, but maybe not be able to anymore. Those are all challenges that businesses that we support are really focused on. When you look at undocumented workers as a whole, the share of the workforce is pretty significant. So as I mentioned, with manufacturing alone, about 5.5, 6% of the workforce are undocumented. That's huge. In certain areas, it's obviously more prevalent, but as we'll show you in a moment, it's surprising some of the counties across the US where sure it's big in some of the larger cities like Chicago and New York and LA. It's also prevalent in some counties across the US and not in any organized way. So for facilities that are in those locations, it really poses a potential challenge on manufacturing. And of course, construction, services, hospitality, even a bigger impact. But if a lot of those undocumented workers were to leave, either forced or not, it would cause some gaps in the workforce. And so federal policy is going to continue to move forward, and this administration today seems very focused on making sure that only the workforce that is otherwise legal and documented to be here and to work is the critical path item. then we just have to plan. We have to think about some of those communities and some of those facilities, again, on the business side, that may have gaps and start to plan accordingly. So how we navigate those challenges is the thing that I know our team at Hickey Associates has been working on night and day for quite some time. The fact that there's been a major change in leadership in DC and and um, a pressure being put on workers that have gone through the immigration system again is nothing new. Even some of the workforce that's come across the border over the last few years that have the special visas, some of you might be familiar with, that allow them to work in the United States for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Those are only temporary workers to begin with. So the millions of people that have crossed the border, even in recent memory, some of them might be legal temporarily. Um, it's only a temporary fix to some of our labor shortages. So the best thing to do, and many companies have been doing this, is just planning on the fact that that was a temporary fix and that many of those workers were set to go back to their country of origin anyway. So there's a lot of upheaval trying to determine not just around undocumented, but also legalized workers, but that might be here temporarily. So when we try to figure out solutions on the business side, and Barry's here, thankfully, to talk about some of the impacts on economic development as well, because it's both sides are trying to work together to try to figure out how to solution set some of the gaps that we've already talked about. So assessing the current footprint, any alternative market sites, they're very interested in learning about those. Where are the places that have the deepest workforce pipelines? Where are those? There's parts of the country, like the corridor between Austin and San Antonio, that have an inward migration that's, if not the highest, one of the top five in the country from within the U.S. They also have a very high millennial population. That's an area of the country that, as well as a handful of others, the businesses want to know more about because those are areas that are a little bit more well, they're certainly sustainable from a workforce standpoint, but they're not going to be as disrupted from some of the policy changes that we're talking about today. Automation is something too we'll talk about in a second. So when we try to analyze where the places around the country that are going to be impacted the most by um, immigration, particularly undocumented immigration, deportation or otherwise, the first thing we take a look at is pending cases. Through 2024, you can see some of the states, of course, get a lot of media attention about where they are. They're a collective place for immigrants to come in and settle. Some of these places have been that way for many decades, if not over 100 years plus. Um, but where we also want to focus is some of the counties and the areas that are otherwise affected by a multitude of things. So what we do is we do something called indexing. So we look at something like this where we say, all right, well, where are the areas that are going to be the most affected by undocumented workers and possibly deportation and other factors around the inputs that affect projects like actual manufacturing jobs, but also the supply chain and everything else that goes into that. So we take this, plus we look at things that guide us around workforce longevity and the risk associated with that. So here's a model that we use where we incorporate a few different things. We look at not just what we might lose as undocumented workers leave the country or go back to their country of origin, but also where unemployment is low, as I mentioned earlier, and also where there's not a lot of inward migration within the United States. So if you've got a business that you're running and you just want to create 15 new jobs, not hundreds, but just 15, 20, 25 new jobs, there's going to be a lot of the country that's not possible. It's going to be a real struggle because you've got unemployment that's very low. So people like their jobs, they're not looking for a new one. And at the same time, there's not new people coming in. So everybody's stuck. And that could be a good thing in a lot of ways, except when you're a business that wants to grow because of lots of reasons why they would. So you can see here when we layer on all these different factors, the the cities that get the most media attention, the Chicago, New York, LA, very high risk for a multitude of reasons. And they're all trying different strategies to usurp those for sure. But what's really surprising to a lot of people is cities like Salt Lake, Baton Rouge, Louisville, Allentown are all cities that are at medium risk, which sometimes to some companies is not and no longer attainable. They're at medium risk because of those three factors that I mentioned, not just because of immigration, but what puts a tremendous amount of pressure on some of those communities is when maybe just a fraction, um, 0.5% of that workforce all of a sudden exits for whatever reason, and you don't have people looking for new jobs, you don't have a high enough unemployment rate where there's enough churn, and at the same time, you don't have enough people that are coming in. Um, that causes a lot of disruption. And so companies are really interested in where that middle ground is as they continue to plan for the future. So when we look at on the county level, because that's probably the most critical. States are big areas of geography, but on the county level, we see things a little bit differently. So you saw those big pockets of states, those blue states that had major pending. When you boil it down to the county level, it's a little bit different. And there's counties that you see here across the United States that have a darker blue, that aren't the traditional places that you might assume have a lot of undocumented workers, but they're spread around the whole country. So some have been otherwise kind of shown there by the federal government or other NGOs. Some have ended up there for different reasons. Some are, no coincidence, major manufacturing centers that need a lot of workers or distribution or otherwise. So that's where we're really focused. So when you layer on a few different things, you look at where undocumented workers that if they many of them were forced to go back to their country of origin, these counties that you see here would be the most affected. Then there's two things though that happen with immigration policy. You have folks that are here in an undocumented manner that go back, but you also have immigration in the future that's that changes dramatically. So what we're seeing here in a policy standpoint in the administration is not just undocumented being shifted elsewhere, but immigration, major immigration changes for people that can come into the country. So on the flip side, what we analyze very closely, because this is the other side of the story, is that where have there been communities extremely reliant on inward migration, legal in most cases, and following the normal protocol, but where have those areas of the country been very reliant on foreign labor? And so if you cut off that foreign labor from growing any further, what would it have on the effects of growth in those areas? That's what we're studying very intently too. So you can see on the county level, you've got counties that rely more than half of that labor force is not from the United States, and so it's swaths of major manufacturing areas of the United States, not just the traditional places that you might think. When you layer on going back to the zero and negative growth without immigration, um, you start to see some really big problems. And it's not an issue of the coasts, it's not an issue of big cities, it's spread around the whole country. These are some of the most dramatic. This is negative growth, so zero from negative growth. All these counties are experiencing right now negative growth. So again, put yourself in a business's position. You want to create new jobs. It could be nominal, not hundreds, but just a few. Really hard to find somebody. And so when you add all these layers, you start to get some challenges. So when we do our analysis, here's an example around construction jobs. You start to see that the concentration of foreign labor coupled with the unemployment rate and the workforce growth rate, because again, the concentration of foreign labor, we're not saying that that labor is otherwise undocumented or not. It's the fact that immigration policies are changing dramatically and that it could very well become an issue to have additional immigrants come and fill those roles as they've been focused in those areas. So as that kind of spigot stops, that can have a dramatic effect on the growth of some of these counties, and some of these counties are growing really fast, and there's a reason why they've tapped into some of that talent. So manufacturing is something we're also focused on, and you can see counties across the Carolinas, in the Midwest, in areas in Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, Ohio, Indiana, all places, Eastern Pennsylvania, all places which have seen a tremendous amount of growth in manufacturing itself, but heavily reliant on workers coming from overseas. And so these are some of the factors that the companies are really starting to pay attention to. And then finally, a couple other industries before I turn it over to Barry. IT. Again, there's a focus on some of the traditional areas where IT is a major targeted industry, like in New Jersey, New York, California. But then there's pockets of places across the country which relies heavily on foreign labor for the IT industry that again could be adversely affected by some of the major policy changes coming up in services. Same thing. So um, again, um, this doesn't necessarily uh, say anything about undocumented versus documented, legal or not legal. These are counties that have been heavily reliant on workers that are not from the United States. And so if you were to change immigration policy, either undocumented or just changing immigration policy from an inward standpoint, there would be the potential for negative effects. At least a stagnant growth opportunity from a labor standpoint is very high. So one way to solve that is developing worker pipelines. I know this is something everybody talks about. We've been talking about this since WIOA was created and all these other programs from the 80s. How do we get people upskilled into the workforce and plugged into jobs? But now is more critical than ever, this moment of time, because training programs and other things on the local level, county and state are becoming even more critical. And companies are relying on those programs. They want to partner with a community college to make sure that people get upskilled and that there's a pipeline established. Now more than ever, companies are paying attention to that. And then, of course, there's automation. We're seeing a huge jump in automation. A recent study showed that between large and small firms alike, automation around manufacturing is skyrocketing. The cost is attainable. It's no longer outside of planet Earth when it comes to affording it, and the fact that the businesses cannot get the labor necessary, automation is the answer. However, the automation is something where there's kind of no turning back. Once a company's made that investment, and it's still very significant, um, there usually is not the ability to right size back into using people to serve some of those roles. So a lot of different fascinating things happening, but it's county by county at the moment. And let me pass it to Barry, who's going to talk about now, even more importantly, how do we actually solve this, and what's the role of economic development as a partner to business and insight consultants like us to help solution this problem that's building pretty rapidly. Barry?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I think for the economic developers on the call today, kind of seeing some of the stuff you're processing for the site selection and corporate side is very interesting, and getting to see kind of behind the veil, if you will. And then hopefully the corporate clients on the phone today also be interested to see what economic developers can do to support them during this process. So when we look, a lot of this stuff you'll see on this list is stuff that a lot of EDOs are already doing. Some are still not, some are, and some are doing it maybe kind of in a initial or not full effort. So kind of maybe getting back and refocusing here. So we're going to walk through some of these, and we'll start with the first one, kind of aligning the workforce needs. So on the next slide, you'll see that the the big thing is more critical than ever is the alignment. When you have plenty of labor, if you're not producing the right, or the companies, not everything's there, there's a lot of flexibility in the market. As the market tightens up, the ability to match what companies need with kind of the programs that a lot of EDOs and their supporting ecosystem around education and workforce training can provide becomes more critical. So here is something, like I said, a lot of people talk about. I think this is an effort that really needs to be a lot of focus on this. A lot of them are just talking to the industries through the BRE efforts, and then trying to make sure that what they're hearing is communicated to the training and workforce partners. Some people are going a step further and doing skills gap analysis. And this would be a kind of a critical deep dive where you're looking into the future, trying to decide what your companies need, what occupations based on what your clusters are, and then trying to decide, do you have enough programs to support that? And so that's kind of an analytical approach versus just kind of going out and talking to everybody. Both work if you're making sure it aligns. So that's the first. On the next one, we're going to talk about is kind of the really reskilling, upskilling. And this is something we've talked about for years. It's something that some EDOs work on, but I think one of the interesting components here is a lot of the undocumented labor or deportated is in some of the lower skill sets, and especially in manufacturing. So as you heard earlier, as companies have to go to automation, then workers that are there in the plants need to be upskilled. They need to go from bending metal to mechatronics. They need to make sure they can make this kind of jump to stay with the company and stay employed. And they're there in your community. They're already an asset. If they're still there, they've mastered a big one, which is just showing up for work these days. But I think the upskilling, reskilling gets a big focus, especially in the direction of automation. And not only manufacturing, you see even in like food service now, a lot of automation going into that. So it's going to be at every level and every cluster. On the next one, you'll see that really this is just more about the role in workforce attraction, retention. A lot of this was tried, interesting enough, kind of coming out of COVID. A lot of programs were stood up on actively trying to recruit people. Some of those are still ongoing, but there's also just the placemaking pieces that economic developers have gotten more involved in the last decade or so, and kind of working on that and building kind of strategies there to help companies. I think one of the things mentioned here is some groups do kind of a regional kind of wage and benefit surveys of information they can share back in their community to help companies kind of better target what they need to provide and make sure they have it so they can attract that labor that is in the market there. On the next one, we're really looking at this ecosystem with the workforce and education. I think this was one of the big first kind of pieces when economic developers moved from just marketing and sales back into kind of the product development piece of their communities, workforces where most people started, and really trying to figure out what they need to do here to really make sure that they align their providers. So this kind of goes back to the alignment, but it's even bigger than that because it's building a bigger pool, a bigger ecosystem around workforce. There's a lot of partners now that weren't there, a lot of nonprofits now, a lot of other groups that can be called on outside of your traditional K through 12 and community college and university system that can also help in companies in this training. The next one is really about data and insights. And this kind of touches on my earlier one of if you can work together as a region and do a wage and salary, that's very powerful for everybody to understand. But it's interesting to us, even the amount of information EDOs have and have it the ready to share and trying to recruit and bring people in. A lot of time that's not shared with existing businesses. And we think that's kind of interesting because you have the data, it's great data. And a lot of times existing businesses don't know where to go to get it from you, or even that it's available, just like you would provide it freely to new companies trying to get in. But just being not only as economic developers always are a convener in the ecosystem one here, but also being able to share information and being really able to kind of get those pipelines of information flowing in your community. On the next one here is really kind of a unique one, I think, and something a lot of communities don't have is we talked about automation. We know it's coming. We've seen it. It's going to be something that is needed. A lot of times when you get into incentives, there's a requirement for jobs, job creation, or some kind of expansion like square footage. Well, obviously, if the reason a lot of companies are having to move in automation is that the labor pipeline is not there, then trying to have a incentive based on hiring people when you're actually just trying to automate to keep up the facility kind of puts it at odds with what is going on. So there are some communities already out there that have automation incentives where you're actually going to your existing companies and you're encouraging them to automate systems. And in doing so, naturally, it's going to take less people, but it's going to take those people, higher skilled people, to run those facilities. So having grants that basically allow you to add new machinery and give you some kind of incentive for that to keep the plant up to date and keep it in your community is big. And a lot of times it's going to be kind of a mental exercise for some politicians, I know. But it's something that would really help your community and something we talk about, and I hear from Jason all the time. You know, a lot of times when companies are evaluating sites, all of these branches, the one in your community, the one 3 states away, the one in another country, all competing for the same funds for that automation. They can't automate every facility in the world, these big companies even. And so they're picking and choosing where they want to automate, and those plants have the best thing to stay and live on in that community. And communities that offer these automation incentives have kind of a it's just like the recruiting. You've got kind of a benefit, a better standing, and something you're showing the community where we want you to stay and automate. And we know that um, it's not going to be adding jobs all the time, but it's more important to keep those jobs and keep higher paying jobs as we move on. So I think that's kind of some of the responses there and some things that definitely you can do and look into. Some you're already doing, some probably not, but all that would support your community kind of being able to keep and still attract even with less people and less jobs available. Jason?
Thanks, Barry. That's great insight. And our final section, you and I get to work together, which is always fun for me.
Yeah.
And that we're going to look at a few different things and think about the future risk management, which I know a lot of businesses are asking us about, and very, of course, economic development organizations of all different shapes and sizes in the U.S. and beyond are doing the same. Talking about a few of these different things around um, charting this path around the uncertainty that we've talked about. Because again, this issue is kind of twofold. One is around undocumented immigration, the changes as people may or may not be located or relocated or asked to go back to their country of origin. The other piece is inward migration, legal migration, normalized migration. It appears from a policy standpoint will also dramatically um, uh, it'll dramatically become a lot smaller than it's had been in some years, filling holes in some of the places and counties that we spoke about. So it's two different things that's affecting workforce on top of other issues that would be a whole nother webinar. So let's talk about first some tactical workforce strategy. So um, one of the most effective ways from a business standpoint is that managing some of those future risks by diversifying their workforce strategy. So looking at recruitment efforts in places that otherwise they may not. I some years back as skills got tighter and workforces got harder to pin down, companies started to go to high schools and begin to educate folks on semiconductors and automation and manufacturing techniques and you name it. Whatever's going on in that community, it started then at the high school level to get them excited about working at the positions that were there available locally. Stopping brain drains and other things, but also tapping into underrepresented labor pools such as veterans and retirees, and of course people with disabilities and even justice involved individuals that may have been incarcerated or um, otherwise been involved in things in their past that some employers would have looked beyond and maybe talked to someone else, or all different categories that companies are strategically looking at to build their talent base so there's a dependence less on different factors that are moving around. And in this case, reduce the dependence on foreign labor while contributing to that local workforce development. Um, Barry, on the economic development side, how can EDOs help with that element of workforce
So
strategy?
this ties together a lot of the things we're already talking about. Once again, the kind of convener function. It's amazing. A lot of economic developers have good partners and go-to partners, but anytime they sit down and really start thinking through all the other partners they could have, especially in the workforce space, it goes 2 or 3x when they actually sit down and go through an exercise to think about the entire ecosystem. And obviously, the more they know, the better the ecosystem and economic development office has, the better they're able to share that with companies and connect them. So I think that's a key piece here. And then that reskilling and upskilling here too, with the automation coming, making sure that people don't get left behind that are workers that have all the kind of core, or what I heard at a meeting the other day, grit traits, showing up, being on time, all of that. Just need help making sure they stay relevant as these facilities get more automated.
In another bullet around managing that risk in the future is around the way that we see it is the strategic site selection and that geographic diversification. A lot of companies have become very interested in not in recent memory, but for a while now, is that how do they create footprints at multiple locations so that if there's any challenge to that single place, they're able to lean on other areas. So I know that the changing immigration policies in one area might make that less viable for reasons, at least in the shorter term. Most of the companies we represent are making decisions for decades. They're not signing like a 1 year lease or buying a building for 2 years. They're going to be there for a long time. And so some of these trends they're paying really close attention to. And so when they look at alternative locations, and all companies look at alternative locations, they're not trying to be um, they're not trying to be cheeky and competing different communities. It's really part of the corporate mission when they look at where they could produce certain things or hire people to execute certain workforce items is to make sure that they're constantly benchmarking. Economic developers benchmark too, right, Barry?
Absolutely. And a lot we've been talking about kind of existing businesses and kind of taking care of that community, which is absolutely the extreme importance. But there'll be opportunities for recruiting, not just globally, but in the US, because a lot of these playing fields will be changing. And a lot of the things that made one area very attractive to companies now will not be an area that they're focused in, or maybe an area they need to leave. And so the recruiting aspect is still baked in here, and something that I think EDOs are probably, of all the preparedness, this is where they're probably most prepared with the changes to actually, as that new opportunities arise, kind of make the pitch of in the new landscape that we're in, why they are still a relevant location.
Yeah, and to stay in a location that might be having some workforce challenges as well as other kind of OpEx issues. So workforce is not the only input into a site decision. You've got utility, you've got access to power, you've got other risks. Our firm is looking very closely at natural related disaster risk, which we've seen in really dramatic, very challenging ways over the last few years that people couldn't even imagine, particularly in areas that are urban or inland, or you wouldn't necessarily associate with some of these larger natural impacts. Automation is one of those things, though, from a workforce standpoint, that can help mitigate the risk and stay in place. And so Barry mentioned something earlier about incentives. You said that a lot of economic development organizations and coaching their stakeholders to look at this closely as well is that maybe incentivizing and inducing automation, although it doesn't create jobs, it's a recommitment to the site. I know from a site selection standpoint, that's the way that businesses feel, but I'm not sure communities sometimes feel the same way yet, Barry.
Well, I tell you, just looked in the feed. If you're going to go somewhere right now, apparently Wisconsin, Heather Smith sent us a note letting them know that their tax credit modernization did remove the job creation requirement. So that's kind of exactly what we're talking here, and a great proactive move by them. But yeah, I think it used to be creation of jobs and retention of jobs. And I think communities have been a lot more open-minded in that existing facilities, just creating, not needing them to create, but just by having them maintain jobs and especially larger employers is still a key win. If they can get that company to stay, modernize, and still, in some cases, employ hundreds or thousands of people, that is still a success for the EDO, even though a lot of times it means less jobs. So I think that awareness, it started, it's probably been a decade or so, people have started getting into the retention of jobs as less jobs. I guess we're always looking at retention, but understanding you might get less jobs is something that people have been slowly kind of coming to grips with. And
Mhm.
so obviously these incentives that take away that job requirement are definitely a clear signal that communities want companies to stay and modernize.
Yeah, and another risk factor are programs that have been around for a long time. They're not without controversy, not without discussion, and it's important to continue to update these programs. But programs like H-1B, which has been able to plug a lot of skill holes, no matter how you feel about some of this and the impacts on immigration and other things, from a data standpoint alone, just looking at the information without any of those aspects, it's plugged a lot of skills that otherwise wouldn't be there. And so, and it's an organized program to help funnel people into the United States, all temporarily, to be able to plug some of those holes. So as those rules change, because the policies are anticipated to change on these programs too, a lot of companies are trying to scramble in certain cases how they have relied on some of these people that are on these special visa programs, but still need to produce, still need to innovate, still need to do the things that H-1B visa people today are doing. So they're looking at the L-1 visa process, for instance, the intercompany transfer, especially global companies that have assets in Europe or Asia and other places. How can they bring in those people that are part of the company already, or hire them and funnel them through that way? It's a little bit different, more dynamics, and not a fast process, and not legally through the L1 necessarily, but just keep in mind that L1s are transferred as an employee typically from another jurisdiction somewhere else. So they have to be hired. So to find that person in another jurisdiction brought over, that all takes time. And so these are impacts as well that the IT industry has gotten the most attention for H-1B visas, but there's lots of companies across the US that focus on research and development, that focus on life sciences and bio. Many of our clients in that sector alone very much rely on H-1B visa skills, people with those skills that have that visa category. And so as that we're anticipating is to get more restrictive. Again, people all documented, all here through following the legal process, but the policy is changing on possibly limiting some of those aspects as well. So that's having an impact on some of the businesses that we represent. And I know sometimes very economic developers on the regional or city or local level may seem like there's nothing they can do on some of these national regulatory immigration issues, but I know you've got some thoughts about at least where to start.
Yeah, absolutely. I know the big companies usually they're very good. They've got some specialization on all these visa programs, but we really see a lot of the small to medium enterprises, especially if they're private or family owned, have a hard time dealing with these issues. And so what a lot of EDOs do now is they're not going to be the group actually helping with the work, so to speak, but they're the group that can provide the support and the guidance and the know-how where to go to get help. So a lot of this is done by specialized attorneys, specialized even groups that this is all they do for a living. And so knowing those resources in your area, in your region, in your state, who those people are, how they operate, which ones you think, based on past, are good at getting these through. Being able to have basically a resource sheet and resources that when you get these smaller companies or mid-sized companies, that you're able to share them and at least give them some options of people who could help them with this process.
And a lot of this is just monitoring what's happening. And I know some of it can get really confusing in real time because it's the transition from one administration, not just now, but in previous transitions, there's always a moment of fluidity between policy shifts and leadership changes, and this is no different in what we're experiencing now after our inauguration here in the U.S. But immigration is a big focus of the now current administration, and so as the policies have begun to roll in, first through executive order, and Congress is now taking on some very key legislation that will dictate some of the things we just talked about, like H-1Bs. I know our firms are looking very closely at the legislation, tracking things at the committee level, and how states and communities are trying to either react or help. But it's really important, I think, to help your local. But so from a business perspective, and Barry, if you don't mind talking about economic development, but just from a business development or business developmental standpoint, to help them, help your local incumbent businesses as economic developers, anyone on this call, just having sessions, educating them on what's happening, having an SME or someone come in and talk about some of these issues so that they could just be made aware and see you as a focal point of knowledge and information as you guide them, as you always have, as economic developers through many different challenges and ups and downs, and you name it. This is another time period, especially if you're in some of those areas that could be adversely affected by some of these policies. Um, you being that focal point to help coach, educate, and be a subject matter expert yourself, I think is really key. Bear, I I know you speak about this all the time, but I think now is a greater moment than ever is for economic developers across the country to help businesses navigate this, as well as obviously a long list of different changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is an interesting piece because a lot of economic developers, if you're housed in a chamber, there's a policy function already there, and there's usually state chambers that are tracking at that level. You're tracking at the local level. A lot of EDOs are set up as nonprofits, so don't have that function per se. But obviously, this is where partners can be a part of it. And so you can reach out and be a hooked into other partners who can kind of do this tracking and feed you that information. So some will be able to get it in-house, so to speak. Others will have to reach out and have a partner that helps monitor this. And they can combine kind of the federal with the state and then package the own local changes going on and how the local area is responding to it. So something some EDOs are good at, some aren't, but something that obviously staying very involved. And there's also associations. So a lot of economic developers belong to the International Economic Development Council, IEDC. They've been very active, almost weekly, getting out policy alerts to their members. So this is where being part of some more of this association type groups really helps.
And we've got a handful of minutes left. I want to make sure we can take a few questions. We've got some really great ones in the queue. Anyone that has a question, feel free to use the Q&A function in Zoom to be able to ask anything. If we're not able to get it on the webinar today, we'll make sure we follow up, of course. But we've got a few that at least we want to get to because they're great. And keep in mind we're recording this, so for any of you that need to leave early, or we hit time and you've got to go to a different meeting, or want to look at some of the content later, we'll share this with everybody. But before we go, one last thing around um, resilience and retention of workforce, and employer-led training programs, and making sure the training programs are highest and best use. There's lots of different training programs out there, but there's a kind of a unique set of programs that we're seeing um, companies be focused on the most. And I know, Barry, this is a big focus of the stuff that you do every day, amongst many things, is these employer-led programs.
Yeah, I think there's a lot, a lot of times EDOs think that everything has to be kind of created on the supply side of what's going on here, when a lot of times companies have some great programs on the demand side of what they do and what they need, and then it's a matter of just tying in and supporting those, maybe helping be a pipeline or a funnel into their programs, which they're already building and using. So I think it's not just kind of what can we provide to companies, but does the company have something to provide to the community in this space that we can kind of tap into and be a part of?
And of course, immigration policy is not the only issue that many businesses and economic developers are facing. Here's a few just coming up in the queue to keep an eye out for. Barry, your team is coming up with a regional economic development strategy report, which is really exciting. Higgin Associates is working on a risk and resilience report to look at flooding, fires, you name it, and just the reality on the ground, and in geographies that are being affected by this, that were unimaginable a few years ago, that we're seeing, unfortunately, people, businesses, and others in supply chain, especially being adversely affected, but ways that we can overcome it. It's always, you'll notice that we try to talk about things in an optimistic way, because there's always a solution to every challenge. And it's about working together, all of us, to try to figure out that solution. And part of it is, finally, an incentives report that we come out usually a few times a year, one that we're coming out with next month in March. To capture all the legislative processes in different states and so on. And so we've got a couple questions around incentives. I want to get to at least one or two in a second, but how can aid help guide also some of the things that we talked about today around immigration? So really appreciate everybody's time today. We've got a couple questions that Barry, if you have a couple minutes after 2 o'clock here Eastern time, we can answer a couple of them. Let me jump in right away. If anybody has any questions, please put them in the Q&A. And again, if we can't get to them today, because we're almost out of time, we'll make sure we follow up. But one question that was great was around incentives. Is it what can what can organizations do from a state and local level, EDO organizations do, to tap into funds to be able to exercise some of the workforce initiatives, training, and other things for businesses? Where can they go and where can they tap into? So um, let me take a second to from the business perspective. Is that historically some of those funds were available from the federal government. That's a bit fluid at the moment. It's just a couple weeks ago, a lot of grants and loans were paused. That still is a bit of an open-ended debate and situation. So some states a while ago, but more and more we're seeing in the legislative process going on right now, are stepping up and putting funding programs into the mix, and so are utilities and other NGOs that may have historically been involved, but they're really stepping up. And Barry, I want to make sure you have a chance to comment, because you're tracking all this as well.
Well, absolutely. I think you mentioned a lot of energy companies are getting involved in helping support workforce training. And I think of all the incentives, and especially at the state, there's some thought here that states might have to step up to fill in for some of the federal reductions in programs, and that could be a differentiator for that state. But that's one that, as far as being controversial or not, most people are going to agree on helping upskill or help people get better training for jobs. So that seems to be an easy one if you're going to reshift some priorities. That's something that can easily be done and something that stays with the community for the most part.
Mhm. One other question, and then we'll have to adjourn. We've gone a little bit over, but want to make sure it's addressed. So, sub question is, a couple of folks have asked about the presentation being available. Is just as a reminder, we'll make sure that everybody has a copy of the recording, and I'm sure we'll make the deck and everything available. So no worries there. From a corporate, what looks like a corporate question is that how do I begin evaluating my company's workforce risk across our footprint? Um, well, from a site selection standpoint, location strategy, what you want to do is look at the workforce inputs and outputs. So that includes not just some of the things that we've talked about today, but there's so many factors that also sometimes don't get addressed but cause huge disruption in workforce longevity. Things like unplanned absenteeism in a community. If it's 1 or 2 or 3 or 4%, it can have dramatic effects on the day-to-day operations of a facility. Drug propensity and drug use. Obviously, many communities across the U.S. Are changing some of those policies around certain types of use, recreation or otherwise, but still, um, there's certain jobs that require a person not to test positive for some of those substances. So those are all things that are in the dynamics, and obviously companies' policies of this are changing rapidly as well. And then there's certain inputs that are also important on an OpEx standpoint, operational expenses, things like taxes, utility costs, um, other inputs that otherwise sometimes get overlooked that align with workforce challenges as well. But the biggest is just the churn that the community that you're looking at or you're currently in need to do the best job as possible is to get people into the workforce or people continue to be upskilled as best as possible. Even if we see a downward shift in people from overseas coming to the United States legally or otherwise able to work, we've got to try to get people as highly skilled as possible, ready to work in jobs that they're excited about, and of course aligned with wages and other things that are growing in lots of areas too. And companies are ready to pay for the investment in longevity and skills. That's for sure. Um, well, we're a little bit over. Thank you everybody for joining. Again, everything will be available accordingly when this is here once the team marketing team packages it all up, we'll send it out to everybody. Thank you so much for joining, and stay tuned for some additional content coming out in the weeks to come. And if anybody wants to download the report, it's available via the Hickey Institute on either website that you see below. But thanks everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Yeah,
Appreciate
thank
you
you.
joining.